I received an email over the weekend with some great questions regarding dual agency because the new listing agreement does not explicitly state a buyer's agent commission, and this leaves dual agency compensation up in the air. And this agent's emailing in to ask about two things: getting paid as a dual agent, and then also their brokerage fee as a dual agent. So I'll skim through the email. I'll read you some excerpts because these are great questions that will answer anyone's question, your question that you may have one day when you find yourself in the position of being a dual agent or potentially owing another brokerage fee or a higher brokerage fee to your brokerage. So this person's writing in to seek clarification on, of course, our brokerage and then dual agency compensation. And they're citing that there are new forms coming out. Now, you may have seen in the video I did of the latest draft of the listing agreement that there is no buyer's agent compensation, but there is additional compensation. There's another line if the buyer's unrepresented. So I just want to state that up front before we get into this. Now, this person writes, there may be a situation in which they choose to act as a dual agent, but the seller would be the only party offering compensation to the listing broker. That's it. So he's saying that the only person offering compensation is the seller in the listing agreement. That's it. That's all that's been addressed. Okay. And then he asks, would I still be responsible for paying brokerage fees on the buyer's side if the seller's not offering any compensation? Because if the listing agreement doesn't offer any compensation and a buyer shows up, how are you getting paid? Now, I'll address this in a few different variables of it. But this agent goes on to give an example scenario. Imagine Mr. and Mrs. Buyer find my listing online. I'll read in the first person. They contact me expressing keen interest in the property, having seen it on multiple occasions without an agent. However, they're unwilling to pay a buyer agent fee or broker fee, citing the recent NAR settlement that's been reported on the news. Okay, let me just stop it right there. Now, if you're a listing broker and a buyer wants to see your listing, your first question to that buyer should be whether or not they have representation. If they're unrepresented, your next question should be, do you want me to represent you? As a listing broker, you should offer that to the buyer. You should offer representation services. That would make you a dual agent. Now, part of the NAR settlement stipulates that if you tour a property with a buyer, you must have a buyer representation agreement in place. And in the buyer representation agreement is commission, the buyer's obligation to pay a buyer's agent commission. So, in a perfect world, you would offer your services to an interested buyer. They would agree. You'd let them know the requirement to sign a buyer representation agreement. They would pledge to pay your commission, and then you're a dual agent. It could be that simple, but it's not in practice, and I'll explain the different variables of it. Now, this person says that this buyer's seen it on multiple occasions without an agent, okay, and that the buyer is unwilling to pay. Okay, fine. So let's imagine that same phone call where you offer your services and the buyer declines. Now, in that case, as the listing agent, I would make the point that you still have the obligation to make your listing available to any buyer despite their representation. Maybe they're represented by an attorney or another agent or no one at all. Either way, make the listing available. And that, I'd say that's a fiduciary obligation to your seller to properly market their property. Now, if the buyer's declining representation, then all you need to do is make the property available for viewing, answer any questions you would, just like if another agent, a buyer's agent, was calling you. But there's no obligation for you to provide any sort of additional accommodations to an unrepresented buyer. Now, in the new listing agreement, there's an additional line for additional compensation if the buyer's unrepresented. I don't know the whole backstory of why CAR put that in there. I actually think that the new listing agreement is not very good and that the compensation section is silly, to put it nicely. But maybe someone realized that it does take into consideration the additional work of having a buyer that is unrepresented being very needy, as they don't have the tools or the knowledge to actually facilitate a transaction. So you have to be very careful if you have a buyer that's unrepresented, because if you start offering services to help them out, now there's what's called a tacit implication of representation. And I'm not trying to be an armchair lawyer or anything, but I'm just saying that I've been over the years, dragged into so many different legal situations. I know that there's risk if you start offering services as a professional to a buyer, and that buyer in any way feels misled in the future, you could be liable. So that's why there needs to be a clear line. There's no gray area in this. The buyer is either represented or not. And if the buyer's not represented, well, you can show them the property, all right? They can come unrepresented, and then at that point, they're on their own. They want to make an offer, great. Make an offer. Go find a form, hire an attorney, do whatever you need. Now, a lot of agents are going to give a CAR form, and I'm sure it's going to happen all the time. And frankly, I personally do not care. But speaking from a purist standpoint, that's not allowed. CAR restricts you. I'm not here to enforce CAR's rules. I do not care. But I'm saying that as with your licensing agreement to use these forms, as a listing agent, you're not even supposed to share a blank form with a buyer. You're already in violation of your terms, your membership terms with CAR. I'm just saying that there's no way for you to get in and assist a buyer, a helpless buyer that's stubborn and refuses representation without you bending the rules or breaking the rules, or at the very least exposing yourself to legal liability. So that's why I'm saying there's no such thing as unrepresented buyer in which you're offering help with. You're sending over disclosures and babying them through it. You need to treat an unrepresented buyer just like you would any other buyer's agent. Await their offer, await their paperwork. Don't give guidance that they can twist and use against you in the future. Now I'm going to continue on to the last part of this email. In this scenario, if I choose to proceed with a dual agency representation, and they're going on about full disclosure and informed consent, would I incur broker fees for both sides of the transaction without receiving buyer side income? That's because our brokerage charges a flat fee per transaction, a low flat fee per transaction side. So they're wondering, if I'm the dual agent, do I have to pay more? Now, I've already responded to this person's email, and one point I made is, if you're the listing agent and the buyer's truly unrepresented, and in the rare case the buyer's actually competent enough to truly self-represent themselves, and you ask for additional compensation in the listing agreement for unrepresented buyers, because there's that line item. There are two line items to take note of in the listing agreement. The seller's broker compensation, listing broker compensation, and listing broker compensation if the buyer's unrepresented. That's basically it. If you add more for an unrepresented buyer, you can keep more without any additional brokerage fee. Now, if you're on a percentage split with your brokerage, they're going to charge you more because you charge more commission if that happens. But this person's wondering, well, there's no payment to the buyer's agent and I have to help these buyers. And my answer is, stop right there. You are not offering any accommodation to unrepresented buyers beyond what your fiduciary obligation is to your seller. That's it. That's why I say make the property available for a viewing to an unrepresented buyer. Offer your services. Make the property available to an inspector, appraiser. You get the idea. But the idea of babying them through paperwork is absolutely unacceptable. It's not only is it exploitive to you and your own business, but it's also a legal liability, because you're now offering assistance that can and will be used against you should this buyer have a change of heart in the future. So my answer is no, you won't be charged unless you truly are the buyer's representative. And if you are, then on the purchase agreement, you're listed as a buyer's agent. And on all the other forms, the TDS, for example, you're listed as the buyer's agent. And then you're truly a dual agent, and you're being paid a dual agent commission, and you will be charged two different transaction sides, the low flat fee for the buyer's side and the seller's side. Now, one final thought is, if the buyer agrees to be represented, or if you put your foot down, as you should, and set a boundary with an unrepresented buyer, and tell them that no, you're not drafting the RPA for them, no, they need to procure their own forms, you have a paid membership in which you cannot violate, you can't break the rules of your membership with CAR that you pay for to baby a stubborn buyer that's refusing representation because they think they're saving money. A better conversation would be to have a conversation with the buyer about making an offer in which they're recompensated whatever they're paying as commission in the representation agreement from the seller, and having a conversation with your seller about it. Because if the buyer's that stubborn, you have to find out what the reason why, and almost always it's going to be related to money and paying your commission. And if they have an issue paying your commission, you can tell them there may be a possibility of a seller concession in which their obligation to pay your commission is reimbursed by the seller in the form of a seller concession. And that's a conversation between the seller and the buyer and you. But you must set a boundary and not offer any accommodations to unrepresented buyers. Please leave a comment. Thank you for watching.